This is a Northcote courtyard, only a few years old, but already showing some problems. The side path is a mess. Bricks have moved, nothing is straight, and water has nowhere to go. This downpipe isn't connected to anything. Every time it rains, that water goes straight under the house. The courtyard itself is granitic sand. Every time the dog comes inside and every time the kids run through, half the courtyard comes with them. The plan is to fix all of that. It sounds straightforward. It never really is. I've got some fresh gear for this one, which is always a nice way to start a new project. I've already got one of these Kelso barrows and it's been great, so the second one just got the same upgrade. 6 cubic meters of granitic sand is going to have to come out here. Every barrow load will have to find its way down the side path, through the tight gate and out into the skip. I'm going to need a coffee and an audiobook to get through this. It's worth talking about what granitic sand actually is, and why it ends up in so many Melbourne gardens. It forms from the weathering of granite. Over time, granite breaks down physically into gravel, then chemically into sand. What you end up with is an angular, coarse material made up mostly of quartz, feldspar, and mica. It's a genuinely good product that adds a natural feel to the landscape. You'll find it on a lot of jobs around Melbourne for good reason, and it's a product I use regularly. This just wasn't the right spot for it. A small inner-city courtyard is a different environment. It's a space that is in constant use. Kids, dogs, bare feet. Granitic sand and bare feet don't get along particularly well. It's coarse and uncomfortable underfoot, and when it's wet, it sticks to everything. Every time someone walks inside from this courtyard, they bring the sand with them. The product isn't the problem. The application is. There's a garden bed in here that has to come out to make way for the new layout. It's a shame, but the plants are worth saving. They'll find a spot somewhere else in the garden. Next step is setting up the string lines. These represent the finished height of the paving. Once they're in place, I can measure down to make sure there's enough depth for everything that goes underneath. The build-up is 80mm of crushed rock, 30 of mortar, and 70 for the brick. So I need to excavate 180mm below the string line before the crushed rock goes in. Get this right now, and everything that follows is straightforward. Get it wrong, and you're in a nightmare. The strings also set the falls, the subtle slopes that move water toward the drains. On a job like this, with multiple angles and directions, that takes some thought. With the excavation in the courtyard complete, I can start on the base. For this, I'll be using compacted crushed rock. It's one of those materials that does its job invisibly. Once the bricks go down, nobody will ever see it again, but it's what determines whether this paving lasts 5 years or 50. It compacts into a dense, stable platform, and because it's permeable, any moisture that finds its way underneath can drain through rather than sitting there causing damage over time. Most of the strength in a paved surface comes from what's underneath, not what you see on top. The crushed rock gets spread evenly across the area and checked against the string lines. It needs to follow the same falls as the finished paving, consistent depth across the whole job, so everything above it behaves the same way. The old bricks from the side path come up next. For 100-year-old material, they're in great shape. I've got 2 pallets of similar ones being delivered. These 500 will get put aside and then mixed in with the others across the whole job. They're a bit of a mix of different stamps, but mainly new Northcote, which is no surprise given where we are. If they all end up in one section, they could look noticeably different from the rest and create patchy sections in the finished paving. But if I mix them through the whole job, that variation becomes part of the character, rather than a problem. The plan was to connect the strip drain into this pipe, but rather than running down as expected, it diverts under the house. There's not enough depth to join into it. I'll have to find a different solution. While digging out the side path, I've noticed this on the laundry door. Paper wasps. The nest they've built is made from chewed wood fibre mixed with saliva, pressed into those hexagonal cells. Unlike most social wasps, they'll reuse old nests. They're actually good to have around, as they hunt pest insects, they pollinate, and they won't bother you unless you bother them first. This old seat is coming out too. It's cracking, it's tired, and as it turns out, It's also an ant nest. Looks like I've had a delivery from Ox. I've always liked the quality of their tools. Tape measures, trowels, levels. Perfect timing, really. So, back to our drainage problem. I'm still going with the strip drains, and I think I found a solution. It's just going to involve digging a trench and adding some extra plumbing. This deck was built over a concrete slab, and that slab has a pit in it. I was planning to tap the courtyard drain into it, but now both drains will have to join it as I'm running out of other options. Our courtyard strip will run where that garden bed used to be, with the lowest end being in this corner. This is the easy part. The harder part is making sure we have enough slope all the way down the path for the water to move toward the drain. It's close, but we're going to make it work. Drainage is one of those things that Melbourne has historically been pretty bad at. The city exploded after the gold rush of 1851, houses going up at a rate that left little room for thinking about infrastructure. Wetlands were filled in, creeks were altered, and the city just kept expanding. By 1910, sewerage existed, but stormwater drainage was still an afterthought. It wasn't until 1924 that legislation was even passed to deal with it seriously. By then, a lot of damage had already been done. The suburbs that grew fastest were often the worst affected. Flat terrain, reactive clay soils, water with nowhere to go, pipes were laid in clay, joints failed, and systems that were inadequate from the start got worse over time. You still see the legacy of that today. Unconnected downpipes, courtyards that puddle, water finding its way under houses. In a lot of older Melbourne suburbs, it's not recent neglect. The problems were built in from the beginning. Northcote itself has an interesting history. In the 1800s, the suburb was considered by Melbourne's planners to be the right place for things the city didn't want too close. The Yarrabend Asylum opened here in 1848, the Inebriates Retreat in 1883, and Fairfield Hospital in 1904. The slaughter yards and piggeries didn't help the reputation either. By the 1870s, the smells were apparently a regular complaint from residents. The suburb where I'm currently fixing someone's drainage was once considered the right place to put the asylum, the drunk tank, and the infectious diseases hospital. It's now one of the most sought after and livable suburbs in Melbourne. It's come a long way. The bricks have arrived. 2 pallets of reclaimed reds, around 1,000 bricks. These came out of a demolition somewhere in the city. Mortar knocked off, stacked, and sold again. It's the best possible outcome for old material like this, back into the ground rather than into landfill. Before the first brick goes down, I'm marking out the rows against the edge of the deck. Getting this right now means the finished paving will line up cleanly rather than ending on an awkward cut. With all the strip trains in and connected, my attention can go back to the base. Before compacting, the crushed rock needs to be sitting at the right level, checked against the string lines, topped up in the low spots, and pulled back where there's too much. It's much easier to make adjustments now than after it's been compacted. Taking the time to get this right now makes everything that follows a lot easier. The plate compactor goes over the whole area, locking the crushed rock together into a dense, stable base. Once that first pass is done, the whole area gets a spray with the hose before compacting again. The water helps the rock pack down even tighter. The more passes, the better. If you're thinking about starting a landscaping business, a compactor should probably be one of the first machines you purchase. I use it on almost every job. One thing worth keeping in mind if you're working solo, these things are heavy. This one is around 55 to 60 kilograms. The bigger one's closer to 90. You're going to be lifting it on and off the ute yourself, so your back might have a say in which size you choose. The hard work is done. From here, it starts to get interesting. One thing worth mentioning, when you're working with cement, wear a mask. The particles aren't something you want in your lungs. I'm not a doctor, but I'd recommend avoiding that wherever possible. Before the first brick goes down, the string line needs to go in. This will be my main guideline for the whole job. It runs along the edge of the deck and extends out beyond it, giving me a straight reference to work back to as the paving progresses. Every row needs to run parallel with the deck. If the rows drift even slightly, it compounds across the whole job, and by the time the paving reaches the deck, the gap will be obvious. The check is simple. Measure back from the string to the nearest brick row at both ends. If those measurements are the same, the rows are running true. If they're different, something has wandered and it needs to be corrected before it goes any further. There's a challenge with this first row. The courtyard needs to slope toward the strip drain, which means by the time the paving reaches the far edge of the deck, there's a height difference from one end to the other. Left as is, that creates an uneven edge along the deck. Not only does it look wrong, it's a tripping hazard. The fix is to twist this first row. Each brick is set at a slightly different angle to the one before it, gradually stepping down across the length of the row until the 60mm of fall has been fully absorbed. By the end of the row, the height difference is gone, and the rest of the paving can continue from there. Let's talk about these bricks for a minute. They're stamped Gamble. I don't come across this one as often as some of the other stamps, but it has a really interesting history behind it. Joseph Gamble started brickmaking in Preston in 1886. 6 years in, the works burned to the ground, and by 1893 he was insolvent. The premises were auctioned off in 1896. Joseph died that same year. His son, James Alexander Gamble, carried the name forward. In 1915, James was managing the Clifton Brickworks when he spotted exposed shale near a bridge while driving his Buick along Ferntree Gully Road toward Ferntree Gully. He knew exactly what he was looking at. He took a sample, had it tested, and it produced an excellent red brick. He sold his shares in Clifton, raising £9,500, secured a bank loan, and used it to build a new works on former market garden land in Oakley. Construction began right as World War I started. Most of the workforce were Italian, because the Australian men had nearly all gone to war. James's daughter Lily lit the kiln when it was complete. She was indispensable on site because she spoke fluent Italian and could communicate with the workers. The clay from the Oakley site was described at the time as almost too good for brickmaking. The 16-chamber Hoffman kiln ran at 200,000 bricks a week. The brick pit itself was unusual, beginning as a shaft driven 120 feet into the ground at an incline, widening out to a working face 100 feet wide. In the 12 months ending March 1975, Gamble's made 10,950,153 bricks. The works closed in 1982. The clay pit became a council tip, then a public park, Reg Harris Reserve. The old machinery was installed as a sculptural feature in Brickmakers Park nearby. Gamble Street in Oakley still carries the name. The clay deposits that produce these bricks are exhausted now. You can't make them anymore. What's left is what was already fired, already used, already living somewhere in the city. These ones came out of a demolition somewhere, were cleaned up, sold to me, and given another chance. Now they're going into this courtyard, where the next stage of their life begins. The pattern these bricks are being laid in is called a running bond. Each brick is offset by half a length from the one above and below it. It's the most common pattern in brickwork and has been for a long time. The Romans used it. The offset distributes load across the whole surface, rather than concentrating it along a single joint line, which makes it structurally stronger than a stacked pattern. It also just looks right. There's a reason it's survived this long. Reclaimed bricks have become increasingly sought after in Melbourne over the last 20 years. As the city's older buildings get demolished, factories, warehouses, terraces, the bricks that come out of them enter a secondary market. Salvage yards buy them, clean them up, and sell them on. The stamps on the frogs, the indented side, tell you where they came from and who made them. The supply isn't infinite. Every time a building comes down, there's a fixed number of bricks that come out of it. The clay deposits that produced most of Melbourne's old reds are exhausted. Hawthorn, Oakley, Northcote. The quarries are parks and reserves now. What's already been fired is all there is. As that supply slowly gets used up, absorbed into renovations and new builds, and gardens like this one, it diminishes. In another 50 years, finding good reclaimed Melbourne Reds in quantity is going to be a lot harder than it is today. Working with reclaimed bricks isn't the same as working with new ones. New bricks are uniform, same size, same weight, same face. Reclaimed bricks are anything but. With so many different manufacturers and clay types, the sizes vary considerably. On this job, the bricks differ by up to 10 mm in width, 20 in length, and 5 in thickness. That variation has to be managed. Each brick needs individual attention to bring it to the right level and keep the surface and lines consistent. Then there are the chips. Edges knocked off, faces worn, corners missing. On a new brick, that would be a defect. On a reclaimed brick, it's character. Every chip and worn edge is evidence of a previous life. A building that stood for decades, hands that laid them the first time, the process of getting them out and cleaned up. You can't replicate that artificially. New bricks try, but the wear on these is honest. It happened. It's real. I actually like the chips. They remind you that you're working with something that's already proven itself. That's not a disadvantage. It's the whole point. This is worth a closer look. A huntsman's exoskeleton. The spider didn't die here. It grew, split its own skin open, and walked away from it whole. Most people would assume it's a dead spider. It's not. It's just what got left behind. Huntsmen are my favorite spider. We usually have at least one in the house, and they're welcome to stay. They hunt the insects that cause actual damage and have no interest in you whatsoever. To hold the garden back, I'm putting in a raised edge. It will help keep the mulch and soil from slipping onto the paving. It also adds a nice softening curve to the area. Grouting is the final step of the paving. The mix goes into the joints, packed down to make sure it reaches the bottom with no voids. Once the joints are filled, the sponging starts, working across the surface to clean the bricks up before the grout sets. On a job this size, it's going to be a long day. Podcasts, audiobooks, an apprentice, or unsuspecting family member will all make the job a little easier. It's slow, methodical work, but it pulls the paving together, literally. Before I finish up, I need to mark a sad occasion. If you've watched the channel for a while, you'll know the Hilux. It's been here for all of it. Every load of sand, every bag of cement, every early morning start. Well, today was its last job. It's hanging up the tyres and heading into well-earned retirement. It's been a great car, an honest car. But we all know landscaping is a young car's game. So, that'll do, Hilux. That'll do. From a distance, this paving doesn't look too bad. But the closer you get, the worse it gets. All the dark bricks are being used in one section, and all the reds in the other. It's hard to make old brick paving look bad, but somehow, this guy managed it. Grout lines you could lose a finger in, filled with polymeric sand that's been breaking up since the day it was laid. The edges have no concrete holding them in, so the whole perimeter is falling away. And somehow, they've managed to slope it toward the house in one direction and toward the studio in the other, which means they must have raised the middle. It's one of the more creative approaches to getting everything wrong I've come across. Although it was only laid 12 months ago, this isn't fixable. It's a total redo. Melbourne's inner north, one of those places that's been through everything and come out the other side with something to say for itself. And right now, somewhere in these streets, we have a courtyard to rebuild. The client has pulled up the bricks and stacked them in preparation, which means I can finally see what we're actually working with. When the paving was this poor, I'm not walking in with high expectations for what's underneath. The base is everything. It determines how long this paving will last in 10, 20, 30 years' time. Time to find out what we've got and whether it's staying or going. The first thing I want to do is get some string lines up. This gives me a fixed reference point across the whole area. I can see exactly where the base sits, what the levels are doing, and where the floors are going. It takes out the guesswork and tells me precisely what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions. The plan is to pitch the paving away from the house and toward the studio, where I'll install a strip drain along the studio wall and connect it directly into the stormwater. There's already a pipe running from this downpipe to a pit down the side of the house, so the connection should be pretty straightforward. Before I make any decisions on the base, I need to dig a few holes and see exactly how much crushed rock is down there. Given the quality of the work above it, I wouldn't be surprised if more corners were cut below the surface as well. For a courtyard with foot traffic only, 50mm is the minimum I'd be comfortable paving on. It'll do the job, but only just. The thicker the better. Anything less than 50mm and the crushed rock comes up, I dig out the soil underneath and relay it at the correct depth. It adds time and cost, but the base is the one thing you can never go back and fix once the paving is down. Luckily, it appears Old Mate actually did an okay job with the base. The levels are all over the place, but at least it's thick enough. I can work with this. Before a single brick goes down, I'm cutting out the high spots and filling the low ones. It's not the most exciting part of the job, but this is where the real work happens. A finished courtyard is only as good as what's underneath it. You can lay the most beautiful paving in the world, but if the base isn't right, it will move, it will settle, and eventually it will fail. Nobody sees this part, but this is the part that really matters. Once the levels are where I want them, the compactor goes over the whole surface. There's something satisfying about this part. You can feel the base firming up underfoot as it passes over. Compact it properly and it's not going anywhere. Skip the step and you'll be back here in 12 months wondering why everything has moved. In one section, the compactor starts bouncing. A different feel, a different sound. I know that sound. Concrete. And it's buried directly below the crushed rock. Leaving it there isn't an option. Concrete moves, and if it shifts, it will crack whatever is laid on top of it. It's also sitting right on the edge of the paving where the lawn will go. Grass over concrete means that section will dry out and struggle to grow no matter what you do to it. It has to come out. What makes it worse, I can see spray paint markings on it. Old Mate knew exactly what was there. Burying it was just the easier option on the day. Under the concrete, I found something else. It's the base of a Hills hoist. Every Australian knows what one of these looks like, but the story behind it is a bit more interesting than you might think. In 1945, Lance Hill returned from World War II to his home in South Australia and found his wife Sherry struggling with the backyard clothesline. So he built her a new one from scrap metal in the backyard. Neighbours saw it, wanted one, and from then on, Lance Hill had a business. What most people don't know is that Lance Hill didn't actually invent the rotary clothesline. A 14-year-old Victorian bully named Gilbert Twain designed the mechanism back in 1902, patented it in 1925, then let the patent lapse. Hill was simply the better businessman. And if you watch my last video, you may remember that Australians have no issues when it comes to claiming things that aren't actually theirs. Materials were scarce in post-war Australia, so you used what you could find. Anti-submarine mesh salvaged from Sydney Harbour became the stay rods. His father straightened and cleaned old pipes, scrounged from wherever he could find them. And Sherry, who inspired the whole thing, painted every finished hoist by hand. The first models had one small problem. The raising lever had a habit of flying from the operator's grasp and hitting them square in the chin. They called them chin whackers. By 1954, they were making 600 hoists a week. It appeared in the closing ceremony of the Sydney 2000 Olympics as a symbol of the Australian backyard. And for decades, in backyards exactly like this one, It was the most important thing out there. And as most Australians will attest, the Hills hoist was never just for drying clothes. Kids spun on the arms until they were dizzy. And for a certain generation of teenagers, it was the centerpiece of Goon of Fortune. A bag of cheap wine tied to the line, spun until it stopped, and whoever it pointed to had to drink. I can neither confirm nor deny any personal involvement in such shenanigans. The strip drain runs along the studio wall. That's where all the water will be directed once the paving is down. Because this courtyard is going down on mortar, getting the drain position and height exactly right is critical. There's no adjusting it later. Let's take a closer look at what we're working with here. These bricks are all over the place, and that's before we even get to the color difference. Getting two completely different bricks to work together in a basket weave pattern and come out looking consistent is going to be one of the more challenging parts of this job. And then there's the color. Reds and blues scattered through the pile. Both need to be spread evenly across the whole surface. This one's going to be a real jigsaw puzzle. Butler and Northkit. Now that's a story. Two brickworks, both born in Melbourne's inner north in the 1880s, both built on the same clay-rich soil that ran through Brunswick and Northkit, competitors for over a decade, and eventually partners. But before any of that, there was a man named Charles Butler, a bricklayer from Hampshire, England, who arrived in Melbourne in 1856 with a trade and not much else. He was good at it. Within a few years, he wasn't just laying bricks, he was building some of Melbourne's most recognised early buildings, the Victoria Coffee Palace, the Methodist Ladies' College, and the Rialto, just to name a few. He was a young immigrant with a trowel, leaving his mark on a city that was growing faster than almost anywhere else on Earth. But Charles Butler had bigger ambitions. In 1886, 30 years after stepping off the boat, he stopped building with bricks and started making them. The South Brunswick Brick Company, 9 to 23 Albion Street, Brunswick. At its peak, over 250,000 bricks a week were leaving that site. Not far away, the Northkit Brick Company had been doing the same thing since 1882. At their peak, around 1.5 million bricks every 10 days. The inner north of Melbourne was being built, street by street, from the clay beneath it. As the drain slopes down toward the connection point, this first row needs a little more thought. If I lay them flat, I'll end up with an ugly lip forming at the far end as the fall increases. So I'm going to twist each brick slightly, starting close to level here and gradually increasing the angle to match the fall of the drain as I work my way along. Anyway, back to the story. Then the 1890s hit. The Great Australian Land Boom collapsed, and it took half the building industry with it. Bricks weren't selling, staff were laid off, both companies were on their knees. The only way out was to stop competing and start cooperating. In 1896, Charles Butler and Son, the Northkit Brick Company, and 3 other Melbourne brickmakers formed the Cooperative Brick Company. Rivals, now under the same roof. Charles Butler died 5 years later in 1901. He never saw the recovery, but his name kept being pressed into clay for another 70 years after he was gone. Eventually, like all of them, the works closed. The quarries filled with rubble and rubbish, and the sites that once produced millions of bricks to build this city became parks. People walk their dogs and fly kites on them now, with no idea what's underneath. All those moments, lost in time, like tears in rain. And somehow, a century later, 2 piles of their bricks ended up in this courtyard, laid badly by someone who didn't know what they had or just didn't care. But not this time. We're going to do better than that. With bricks this inconsistent in size, this really is a giant jigsaw puzzle. I find it easier to stand them all on their side. That way I can scan across the pile and instantly read the length and width of each one. The long, skinny ones are the key to making this pattern work, so those get flipped on their end, ready to grab when I need them. These bricks built inner Melbourne, the workers' cottages, the terraces, the shop fronts, the humble milk bars. They define the inner suburbs to this day. But if you'd walked into the backyard of one of those houses 100 years ago, you wouldn't have recognized it as a place anyone was meant to enjoy. The backyard wasn't a garden. It was a utility corridor, a wood heap, a wash house, a chook house along the back fence, an incinerator, usually an old oil drum, for burning whatever couldn't be kept. And at the very back, against the fence, the outhouse, accessed from the back lane by the nightman who came round to collect the pan. Nobody designed these spaces. Nobody valued them. They existed purely to keep life's unpleasant necessities out of sight and out of the house. And life in these streets was hard. By the early 20th century, inner Melbourne suburbs were overcrowded and underserviced. Narrow houses, sometimes 3 or 4 dwellings squeezed onto a single allotment. No proper sanitation. Poor ventilation. Disease moved easily through streets like these. In 1923, a Methodist reformer named F. Oswald Barnett walked through the slums of inner Melbourne and was so disturbed by what he saw that he documented it. Babies on bare floors, children playing in evil-smelling lanes, mothers unable to keep them clean, no matter how hard they tried, not through laziness or neglect, simply because the conditions made it impossible. These were the people who lived in these houses, who hung their washing in these backyards, who had no concept of an outdoor room because survival was the only concept that mattered. It took decades for things to slowly improve. Sewerage arrived. The outside toilet was eventually duplicated inside, though for a long time it stayed at the back of the house, still blocking any real connection between the home and the garden behind it. But the backyard remained what it had always been, a functional space, not a living one. Even the Hills hoist stood its ground for decades, spinning away in the middle of the garden like it owned a place. The shift, when it came, started inside the house. The Victorian terrace and the workers' cottage were designed with a very specific logic. Front rooms for receiving guests, the parlour, the formal spaces that faced the street, everything else pushed to the rear. Kitchen, bathroom, laundry, toilet. The back of the house was the utility end, and the backyard behind it was simply an extension of that thinking. For most of the 20th century, If you wanted to get from your living room to your backyard, you walked through the kitchen and the laundry and past the bathroom to get there. The garden was an afterthought, a place you occasionally visited, not somewhere you lived. Anyone who has bought one of these houses in North Kit, Fitzroy, Brunswick, or Collingwood knows exactly what I'm talking about. And they'll also know that every one of these houses falls into one of two categories: the ones where the bathroom renovation has been done, and the ones still waiting. That renovation is almost always the same thing. Move the wet areas out of the back of the house, centralize the bathroom, push the kitchen and living areas toward the rear, install glass doors. And suddenly, for the first time in the history of that house, the backyard is visible from the kitchen and the living room. Open-plan living didn't just change the inside of these homes, it changed the relationship between the house and the garden entirely. The back of the house becomes the front of the house, in terms of where life is actually lived. And the Hills hoist? It got pushed down the side of the house, out of sight, because the backyard had become too valuable to give over to a clothesline. It's a relatively recent shift, and it completely changed what people expected from the space behind their home. A courtyard that was once purely functional, somewhere to store the bin and hang the washing, became somewhere to sit in the evening. A place to eat outside, an area to landscape, light and furnish. Outdoor living has become genuinely central to the Australian way of life. The barbecue, the outdoor table, the fairy lights, the pot plants, the water feature, the outdoor kitchen, the fire pit, the carefully chosen paving. What was once a bare concrete slab behind an old worker's cottage has become an extension of the home itself. Architects now design around it, real estate agents sell it, and landscapers like me get called in to make it worth the investment. It's somewhere worth getting right, which is exactly why a courtyard that's only 12 months old is worth pulling up and starting again. When it's draining under structures and already falling apart, you don't patch it, you do it properly. Because when a space matters, the details matter. Every single one. A few of the larger bricks are protruding too far into the grout lines. I've marked the worst offenders, and I'm just going to spend a few minutes trimming them back. Before grouting, I like to cover any surfaces I don't want stained. A wet grouting sponge will leave marks on almost anything it touches, so a bit of plastic makes the process much easier. Not all sponges are created equal. Different textures, different absorbency levels, and depending on the weather conditions on the day, I'll often reach for a different one. While the grout goes in, it's worth taking a moment to talk about the pattern itself. And before you panic, I'm aware I've already dragged you through 140 years of Melbourne history. This one's quick, I promise. The pattern is called basket weave. It mimics the over-under weave of a physical basket, and it's older than almost anything else we've talked about today. Basket weaving itself predates pottery. It predates writing. Archaeological evidence places woven baskets in ancient Egypt over 10,000 years ago. The brick version of the pattern has been used in courtyards, pathways, and paved surfaces for centuries across Europe and the Middle East. It's not the strongest structural pattern. Herringbone distributes load better for driveways and heavy traffic areas. Basket weave is chosen for courtyards for its visual warmth and its decorative quality. It breaks up the surface without the busyness of herringbone. And it suits reclaimed brick particularly well. The slight variation in size and color that comes with old materials gives the pattern a texture and character that a uniform modern brick simply can't replicate. Everything you see exists together in a delicate balance, and every slight difference becomes part of the surface rather than a flaw in it. To connect the courtyard to the main path, I'm dropping in a few small bluestone steppers. Bluestone and brick, two of Melbourne's most iconic materials. They just belong together, like peas and carrots. Two companies, one courtyard, and 140 years of history. Back where it belongs. It took two goes to get it right, but some things are worth doing twice. I'll see you at the next job. This is one of the biggest properties I've worked on recently, with 60 metres of bluestone pathway and reclaimed brick edging going in. And somewhere in the research for this one, I found out this suburb was legally dry for 90 years. No pubs, no alcohol, nothing. But life finds a way. We'll get to that. This property runs deep, from the front garden all the way to the back. I'm going to be installing around 60 metres of bluestone pathway, large natural edge steppers, each one set individually on mortar. The whole thing will be bordered with reclaimed old red bricks and finished off with Tuscan toppings. As usual, I'll be working solo. Let's see if I've got enough left in the tank for this one. What could go wrong? First things first, I'll set up some string lines to see the levels. I want the path to run flat through this section. I'm not alone out here though. This property has 4 chickens. They stopped laying a while back, but that doesn't seem to bother anyone, least of all the chickens. They follow the digging because they know exactly what it means. Every time I start digging, they're there. Worms, grubs, beetles, whatever the ground gives up, they're onto it before it has a chance to go anywhere. They've worked out that a landscaper with a shovel is worth following. One of them in particular seems to have strong opinions about where the work should be happening, and isn't shy about making that known. Backyard chickens used to be completely normal in suburbs like this. Through the Depression and through both World Wars, a few chooks in the backyard wasn't a statement about sustainable living, it was just how a household ran. They provided eggs, fertilizer, and pest control. Suburbs like this one in the 1940s were still close enough to their farming origins that nobody thought twice about it. Then post-war Australia decided what a proper suburban backyard was supposed to look like. Neat lawn, garden beds around the edges, a hill's hoist. Chickens didn't fit, they were messy. They scratched things up and they made noise at inconvenient times. So slowly they disappeared from most Melbourne backyards, and keeping them went from being practical to being slightly eccentric. Then, somewhere in the last 20 years, they came back. The sustainability movement, the interest in knowing where food comes from, the general suspicion of supermarket eggs, all played a role in this, and backyard chickens started appearing in Melbourne gardens again. The chickens never really changed. They just kept scratching around, laying eggs, and fertilizing whatever soil they were in. The city just came back around to them. Sounds like our bricks have arrived. These reclaimed old red bricks are going in as the edging along both sides of the path. The edging is what gives a path like this its definition. It holds everything in place, draws the line between the Tuscan toppings and the garden beds, between the path and the lawn. Without it, you just have a strip of gravel in a garden. And red brick alongside bluestone. There's something about that combination that just works. The warmth of the red against the cool dark of the blue. They've been used together in Melbourne for 150 years, and they still look right. Some things just do. The whole path will sit on a compacted crushed rock base. It drains well and gives the blue stone and brick something solid to sit on that won't move. The front sections of this path are going to be curved. To get a curve that looks natural rather than forced, I'm laying out a hose and adjusting it until the line looks right to my eye, then marking it in with spray paint. You could also use a power cord for this. Once you're happy with one side, you can use a tape measure to get the exact curve for the other side. Just measure out the width of the path using your painted line as a guide. I also sometimes mark up a stick or broom handle with the width and use that instead. You'll see me do exactly that a bit later on. And here comes the main event. In these crates are 70 large bluestone steppers. These will be the spine of this path. Before the crushed rock goes down, I'm going to put some landscaping fabric over the scoria. It keeps the layers separate and lets water pass straight through and into the buried drain beneath. This entire garden is covered in kikuyu, and if you're not familiar, it's a type of grass, though calling it a grass is a bit like calling a crocodile a lizard. Technically accurate, but leaves out the important part. Kikuyu comes from the highlands of East Africa. It's named after the Kikuyu people of Kenya, who had deep agricultural knowledge of the plant and used it as livestock feed for generations. It evolved at elevation with warm days, cool nights, unpredictable rainfall, and long dry spells. These harsh conditions shaped it into something that's extraordinarily resilient and very hard to get rid of. It developed two separate systems for spreading. Above ground, it sends out stolons, which are runners that travel horizontally across the surface, rooting as they go. Below ground, it spreads through rhizomes, an underground network of stems pushing outward in all directions simultaneously. It doesn't need to flower to spread. It doesn't need ideal conditions. It can't be bargained with. It can't be reasoned with. It doesn't feel pity or remorse or fear. And it absolutely will not stop. Australia was one of the first countries to bring it in. The first seeds arrived in 1908 from the Congo. They were actually intercepted by customs because the package came in with no label and no documentation. It was completely unmarked. A local botanist grew the seeds just to identify what they were, and once he did, he was apparently impressed enough to collaborate with Australian universities to help establish it across the country as pasture and fodder grass. It was introduced to solve a problem. It then became a different problem, depending on who you ask. By mid-century, kikuyu was in lawns all over Melbourne. It's hard-wearing, drought-tolerant, recovers fast from damage, and stays reasonably green through winter when a lot of other warm-season grasses give up entirely. For a busy family backyard, it has a lot going for it. The issue is that it doesn't really recognize boundaries. It will cross a garden edge, infiltrate a bed, travel under a path, and come up on the other side. Greenskeepers at golf courses spend serious money and time trying to remove it from areas where it doesn't belong, the greens, the fairways, the fine turf zones, while simultaneously managing the rough, which in some courses is kikuyu. The same grass, just in the wrong place. Digging it out before a job like this is not a quick process. You're not just clearing the surface. You're following the root mass down, pulling runners, trying to get as much of the rhizome network out as possible before the crushed rock base goes in. Because if you don't, it'll find its way back. It will come up through gravel. It will work along the edge of a path for years, looking for a gap, given enough time, it will find one. The only way to get rid of it is by carefully digging out all the roots, and 60% of the time, this method works every time. When I'm on a job like this, I like to find something interesting about the area. It gives the work a bit of context. So I looked into the history of Baldwin North, and I have to be honest with you, there isn't much. Farms, then houses. Dairy farms, then a tram line, then more houses. For a suburb that prides itself on being one of Melbourne's most desirable postcodes, Baldwin North has had a remarkably uneventful history. And it's not even really its own place history-wise. It's just the area north of Baldwin, which was named after someone else's vineyard. So Baldwin North is so historically unremarkable that it couldn't even come up with its own name. The only two cultural highlights I could find were these. In 1961, the first Coles supermarket in Australia was built here. And in the early 1950s, John Brack, one of my favourite Australian artists, painted the North Baldwin tram terminus while living nearby. Brack went on to paint Collins Street 5 p.m, which is probably the most recognised Australian painting of the 20th century. So, to summarise the cultural highlights of Baldwin North, a supermarket and a painting of a tram stop. The tram stop painting is genuinely beautiful, for what it's worth. I did find something worth talking about though. In 1928, temperance campaigners turned the area into a dry zone. No pubs, no bottle shops, no alcohol, full stop. The local Protestant churches lobbied hard for it, and they got it. If you lived here and wanted a drink, you had to leave. That's a strange thing for a suburb to do on its own, so I went looking into why. And that's where this story gets genuinely good. Go back to 1916. Victoria, along with most of the rest of the country, brought in something called 6 o'clock closing. Pubs had to shut at 6 p.m. The idea, pushed hard by the temperance movement, was that if people had less time to drink, they'd drink less. It was meant to be a war austerity measure, and it stuck around for 50 years. It didn't really work the way anyone planned though. What it actually created was the 6 o'clock swill. Picture this. You knock off work at 5, you've got 1 hour. So does everyone else. So the entire male workforce of a city pours straight into the pub and tries to drink as much beer as humanly possible before the doors shut. The pubs were packed, wall to wall with standing room only. Men with one elbow on the bar, shouting over each other's heads to get served. It was, by every account, absolute chaos. And here's a detail I love. If you've been to Melbourne, you've probably walked past 100 old pubs and noticed a band of ceramic tiles running around the outside walls, 5 or 6 feet up from the footpath. That's not just decoration, although it does that job too. Those tiles went in because the pub needed to be hosed down at the end of the night. 6 o'clock closing meant an hour of absolute carnage, and then everyone poured out onto the street at once. Beer, spills, and worse. The glazed tiles washed down a lot easier than bare bricks did. So the next time you're standing outside an old pub, look down. You're looking at architecture that was built to deal with how Melbourne used to drink. Women, by the way, weren't really part of this scene at all. Through this whole era, pubs ran a public bar for men and a separate ladies' lounge with its own entrance, sometimes its own toilet, and was kept well away from the swill. This painting by John Brack, called The Bar, captures the scene perfectly. Women could serve drinks in the public bar, they just weren't allowed to drink there as a customer. In some states, it was actually illegal for a woman to be served a drink in a public bar. In Queensland, in 1965, two women, Merle Thornton and Rosalie Bogner, chained themselves to the footrail of a Brisbane pub in protest. The police were called, but decided they weren't willing to remove them on camera and told them to have a good night and don't drink too much. The protest made international headlines, and the law changed 5 years later. The bar where it happened is now called Merle's Bar. Merle Thornton was also, for what it's worth, the mother of Australian actress Sigrid Thornton. Which brings us back to Baldwin North. In the middle of all of this, the swill, the tiled pubs, the segregated bars, a suburb full of church-going young families looked at the whole mess and said, "Not here." They voted themselves dry in 1928 and stayed that way for the better part of 90 years. And here's the bit I really like. Baldwin North is named after Baldwin, and Baldwin means home of the vine. The man who founded the suburb literally planted a vineyard on this land in the 1850s. Within 2 generations, the place had banned alcohol entirely, so the home of a vine became the home of absolutely nothing you could drink. It wasn't until 2015 that Baldwin North's dry zone was finally lifted, 90 years later. The most exciting thing to happen here in living memory is that you're now legally allowed to buy a beer. So, that's the history of Baldwin North. A suburb with not a lot to write home about historically, sitting right in the middle of one of the funniest periods of Australian drinking history, having decided to have absolutely nothing to do with any of it, while ironically being named after a vineyard. Whether the boring history and the dry zone are connected, I'll leave for you to decide. With the brick edging in, the middle of the path needs to come up a bit. The bluestone steppers are a very different thickness to the bricks, so to avoid having to make up the height difference with a crazy amount of mortar, I'm going to use a bit more crushed rock to get the levels right. There's a question worth asking when you're working with a stone like this, which is, how did it get here? I don't mean to this property specifically, we just watched it come off a truck, but how did it get to the point where it's the thing people ask for? Bluestone was formed by volcanic activity across the western plains of Victoria, from lava flows and eruptions that happened over millions of years, some as recently as 10,000 years ago, which is close enough to the present that early Aboriginal people in the region almost certainly witnessed some of it. The stone that's sitting on this garden today started as molten rock, moving across a landscape that looked nothing like it does now. When Melbourne was being built in earnest through the 1840s and 50s, bluestone was the obvious choice for construction. It was everywhere, quarried in Footscray, Clifton Hill, Coburg, Brunswick, and all through the inner suburbs that sat on top of the basalt plain. It was harder than most alternatives, resistant to weathering, and there was an enormous amount of it just below the surface. It went into the buildings, the bridges, the jail, the gutters and curving of the city streets, the foundations of some of Melbourne's most famous sandstone buildings, Parliament House, the Treasury, the Town Hall, are bluestone underneath. The grand facades were limestone and sandstone, but the thing holding them up was bluestone. The quarrying itself is also worth a moment. Early bluestone quarrying was done by hand. Workers hammered wedges into natural cracks in the rock to split it, then roughly squared the blocks with a knapping hammer before loading them onto horse-drawn carts and hauling them to site. By the 1850s, they were using explosives, drilling holes, packing them with black powder, and lighting the fuse. The person who placed and lit the explosives was called the powder monkey, traditionally the highest paid and most dangerous role in the quarry. Many men were killed or injured doing the job. It was very much a buy the ticket, take the ride kind of deal. As the bluestone I'm using here was cut by machines, the surfaces are incredibly smooth. To make sure they stick to the mortar and don't pop off, I put a primer directly onto the stone before laying them. I use a mix of bonding agent, cement and water mixed into a paste, then use a small paint roller to apply it. A significant amount of the quarrying was done by convict labour. Quarries at Clifton Hill were worked by prisoners from the Collingwood Stockade. Pentridge Prison in Courtyard was built from bluestone quarried on site by the prisoners themselves. They built their own jail. The site where they quarried it has since been turned into Coburg Lakes, where people now go for Sunday afternoon picnics. If you look carefully at bluestone blocks in Melbourne's laneways, you'll sometimes see marks scratched into the surface. Those are convict identification marks. Labourers scratched their initials into the stones they'd cut so they could be credited for the work. The stone remembers things the city has long since moved on from. And then, by the 1880s, Melbourne decided it was over it. Bluestone had started to feel like the wrong material for a city trying to project confidence and prosperity. It was dark and heavy. It was associated with the convict era, a past the city was actively trying to move away from. Fashionable buildings started getting faced with lighter stone, or rendered over entirely. Sandstone and granite became the prestige choices. Bluestone got pushed to the edges, the landways, the back streets, the infrastructure you used without noticing. It stayed in that position for a long time. Still everywhere underneath the city, still in the curbs and gutters, still in the laneways running behind the terraces, but not chosen, not sought out. It was regarded as something to be hidden rather than celebrated. What changed is harder to pin down precisely, but somewhere in the second half of the 20th century, the laneways of Melbourne stopped being the back of the city and started being something people actually sought out. The dark stone, the texture, the sense of age, what had felt oppressive started feeling like character. Cafes and bars opened in lanes. Street art appeared on bluestone walls. The very quality that made bluestone feel heavy and forbidding became the thing that made it feel like Melbourne. It's in the laneways tourists photograph. It's in the gardens of houses like this one. It's on the mood boards of landscape designers and architects across the city. It's once again celebrated like it always should have been. It's the stone that built Melbourne. It's our stone. I've laid a lot of bluestone over the years. It still has a weight to it that most materials don't. And I don't just mean physically, though it has that too. These steppers are all very different shapes, which means the focus is in the spacing and the layout. There's also a catch with these. Because the rock is sliced, the stones cut next to each other end up very similar in shape. Put two of those next to each other in the path, and it looks wrong immediately. So, part of the job is separating the shapes and distributing them across 60 meters, so the whole thing reads as natural rather than repetitive. Get it right, and it looks like it was always supposed to be there. The first thing you notice is how orange the Tuscan toppings looks. It's almost alarming. But once it gets wet, it settles right down and the true colour comes through. And when you look closely, it's not just one colour at all. There are blues, greys, pinks, creams. It's a whole mix of crushed stone in there. The orange is just the first impression. toppings hold moisture, which is fine in the middle of a path, but not ideal sitting directly against a building. So before the toppings go in along the wall, I'm running a strip of thick plastic damp course along the base. This creates a barrier between the toppings and the stone. I'm about 4 barrow loads short. Nothing dramatic, but I'll have to come back tomorrow to finish off the last section. It wouldn't be a proper job without at least one trip back anyway. Like my little feathered friends on this job, I'm no spring chicken anymore. My mind and body are starting to ask for a rest. For once, I'm actually going to listen and take a couple of weeks off. And this has got absolutely nothing to do with any good surf that may or may not be happening. Thanks for watching. I really do appreciate all the comments you guys leave. Honestly, thank you. I'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Bye for now. Most properties have one. The strip down the side of the house that's too narrow to be useful, but too visible to ignore. It collects rubbish, grows weeds, and becomes the dog's domain. This one's no different. Old concrete, rubble. It's just dead space with wasted potential. And this one is about to be completely transformed. Brick steppers, Tuscan topping, steel edging, a garden bed, and hedges along the fence. And up top, in a lawn that's already showing where people want to walk, stone steppers to make it official. There's a concrete path to remove first, and with concrete, you never really know what's underneath. It's the first really cold morning in Melbourne this year, which always catches you off guard. My fingers hurt. And now my back's going to hurt, because I just pulled landscaping duty. There's an aircon unit on the concrete down here. That section's going to stay. I'll mark out a quick guideline to make it as neat as possible. There's no quiet way to do the rest of this. Sorry, neighbours. Quick note if you're ever doing this yourself. Before that blade goes anywhere near the ground, know what's underneath. Service is run under concrete all the time. Gas, water, electrical. You won't see them coming, and you won't get a warning. Dial before you dig is a free service. Use it if you're unsure. The trusty old wheelbarrow is going to get a serious workout on this job. But it's a trooper. I genuinely rate it. And when I say trooper, I mean that more literally than you'd think. The wheelbarrow was designed for warfare. It's usually credited to a Chinese statesman and military general, whose name I'm going to absolutely butcher here. Zhu Biliang, in around 231 AD. He called it the wooden ox, The problem he was trying to solve was simple. How do you keep an army fed and supplied when you're moving through difficult terrain with a labor shortage? His answer was one wheel, two handles, one person. According to some accounts, a single soldier could carry enough supplies to feed 4 men for an entire month. It was considered such a military advantage that they tried to keep it completely secret. The wheelbarrow was classified information. Smooth. He probably didn't actually invent it though. Archaeological evidence puts wheelbarrow-like devices in China at least a century earlier. There are 2 murals from the 2nd century, including one dated to 1180 AD, showing something you'd recognize immediately. So Liang most likely just refined an existing idea and figured out you could use it in a war. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Chinese design was nothing like what I'm pushing around today. Their wheels sat in the center of the barrow, not at the front, and that one difference changed everything. When the wheel is in the center, it takes the full weight of the load. The operator carries nothing, they just steer. Some accounts suggest a single soldier could move enormous loads over rough terrain, 10 kilometers a day, and some versions were even fitted with sails to catch a tailwind on flat ground. Chinese military strategists reportedly deployed wheelbarrows in a circle as a rapidly assembled barricade, basically a mobile fort, and some versions apparently had weapons mounted directly on them. It turns out that under the concrete path is another concrete path. A path within a path. We need to go deeper. While China had been doing this for nearly 1,000 years, the West hadn't even worked out the wheel part yet. Before the wheelbarrow arrived, the standard solution was the hand barrow, basically a stretcher with handles at both ends, requiring 2 people. The wheelbarrow replaced one of those people with wheel. A simple idea, but it took them a remarkably long time to get there. The first record of a wheelbarrow in Europe turns up in 1222, the purchase of 8 wheelbarrows for the King's Works at Dover, which was considered noteworthy enough to write down. The European design was already different to the Chinese one. Wheel at the front, load behind, operator sharing the weight. Better for short hauls and tipping, which suited a building site perfectly. It spread into agriculture first, then construction, then mining. For 2 centuries, it was still a relative rarity. Not until the 1400s did it become a common sight across Europe. And then came the Industrial Revolution. The navvies, the Great Canal and railway building gangs of the 18th and 19th centuries. Men who ate extraordinary amounts, drank even more, and moved half the landscape of Britain with a barrow and a bad attitude. The barrow grew with the work. By the late 19th century, metal barrows were being made, heavy but durable. And then came the war. In the trenches of World War I, the wheelbarrow was everywhere, shifting ammunition, carrying wounded soldiers off the battlefield, and excavating the mud to build the trenches themselves. The barrows used were mostly wooden, because wood was lighter and less likely to sink. Metal was needed for more important things. Nearly 2,000 years after Liang adapted it as a military tool, it was still doing military work, in the mud, under fire. Right, strings up first so that we can see what's going on with the levels. This passage drops away a fair bit from top to bottom, and it's not a consistent slope, so I need to work out where the transition's going to happen before the crushed rock goes in. Before the mortar goes in, we need a proper base. You don't put mortar directly on soil. Soil moves, holds moisture, and settles unevenly. The mortar cracks, the bricks shift, and eventually you've got a trip hazard. Crushed rock compacts down into a stable, well-draining base. It gives the mortar something solid to sit on and stops water pooling underneath. That's what keeps the steppers level and locked in place long term. Before I go any further, it's time for some insurance. Having soil and other material pushed up against this brick wall doesn't sit right with me. I'm going to install a barrier to keep the moisture away. I'll touch on Melbourne's rising damp issues a bit later on. These Castlemaine slate stones have been sitting in the front garden doing not much, so they're coming around the back. A lawn up here is already showing a worn line down the middle, people and the dog taking the same route every time. The stones go where the path wants to be. They'll get dug in and set on mortar later. For now, I just want to see how the spacing looks and how it will join into the brick steppers. This sewer inspection point needs to land right between two stepstones. You can cover it with top-in, but not mortar and brick. So rather than starting at the top and hoping it works out, I'm starting here and paving away from it in both directions. I've got a bit of play at the other end to make it work. This property was built around 1920, which means this side passage has been here for over 100 years. For most of the early 20th century, the side passage on a suburban block like this was purely functional. Services ran down it: water, gas, and later electricity. The hot water system lived down here. Bikes leaned against the fence. Garden tools were stored along the wall. It was the utility corridor of the house, the part you walked through to get somewhere else. Nobody sat in it, and nobody admired it. That wasn't what it was for. And that thinking shaped how people maintained it. You didn't need it to look good, you needed it to work. So when the ground got muddy and uneven, you poured concrete. Cheap, quick, and low maintenance. Problem solved. Which is exactly what we found when we got here. A concrete path that someone poured to solve a problem that needed solving. It wasn't wrong for its time. It was exactly right. And it wasn't the only concrete path we found. Underneath that first path was another one. A different era, a different pour, the same thinking. The side passage is a problem to be managed rather than a space to be enjoyed. The Australian relationship with the backyard is relatively recent. In the early 20th century, it was functional: a vegetable patch, a chook pen, and a clothesline. Not really designed, just used. After World War II, that changed. Returning soldiers built homes on new suburban blocks. Lawn became the standard as it was relatively easy to maintain and good for kids. The barbecue arrived, and soon the backyard became a place to spend time in, not just work in. From the 70s and 80s, the garden started to be seen as a designed space. Paving, decking, and garden beds became common. Landscape gardening turned into an industry rather than just something you did on weekends. People started thinking about their outdoor space the way they thought about their interiors, adding furniture, lighting, and plants. By the 90s and 2000s, the backyard was a full outdoor room, often containing kitchens, landscape garden beds, and water features. Outdoor entertaining became a thing. The backyard wasn't just for work anymore, it was for living. And eventually that thinking made it all the way around to the side of the house. These bricks came from this property. Last year I built a patio here, and these are the ones that didn't quite make the cut. Most were a bit too damaged for that project, but still way too good to throw out. So, we've turned them into stepstones to tie in with the existing brickwork around the property. We chose not to do a solid path for a few reasons. First, we didn't have enough bricks, but also, this passage runs on a pretty steep slope. A solid path would just send water straight down and flood part of the garden at the bottom, which means drains, which means more cost and complexity. Stepstones let the water soak into the soil instead. With a solid path, you're just getting from A to B, but with stepstones, it's more of a garden that you move through. The variation in these bricks with the different sizes, colors, and chips stop being a problem and becomes a feature. No two of these steppers look exactly the same, and that's not a flaw. That's what gives it character. It's time to set the stone path in place. It's early winter and the lawn has just gone dormant. I want to disturb it as little as possible while I dig down for the crushed rock and mortar base. It won't start growing again until spring. The soil coming out of here is really good. It's dark and full of worms, so I'm going to keep it for the garden beds. One thing to watch though, buffalo roots are aggressive. Make sure you get every root out before it goes anywhere near the garden beds, or they'll shoot and you'll have buffalo coming up where you don't want it. These stones are heavy, but heavy doesn't mean stable on its own. Without mortar underneath, any unevenness in the ground means the stone can rock. A rocking stepstone is a trip hazard. The mortar beds them in solid and keeps them exactly where they need to be. Next is getting this garden bed ready. First thing is to turn the soil over, which loosens it up, improves drainage, and gets air down to the roots. There's actually a school of thought now that says you shouldn't turn soil at all, no-till gardening. The idea being that soil has its own structure, its own microbial networks, and every time you put a shovel in, you're disrupting all of that. It's a good theory, except in this case when the soil is completely full of old broken bricks and plastic sheeting. 3 full wheelbarrows of broken bricks came out of this section. You've got to love the thought process of some builders. Just chuck some soil over the rubbish and make it someone else's problem. Happy days. Going in a Waterhousey floribunda. They can be left as a single tree, but it's more commonly hedged, which is what we're doing here. It'll hide the fence, but it also fills the space with greenery and lifts the whole area. They have a soft weeping habit, and the new growth comes through pink before turning green. In a narrow space like this, lighter foliage actually matters. Dark leaves soak up light and can make an enclosed area feel smaller and more closed in. Lighter, brighter foliage reflects light back and helps a tight space feel more open. And there will be a feature tree going into the curtain ring. A forest pansy, it's one of those trees that never really stops performing. Delicate light purple flowers in spring, then the new leaves emerge deep red before maturing to a rich purple-green through summer. In autumn they go yellow before dropping, and the whole cycle starts again. I'm still trying to track down a good one. When I do, it'll be the centerpiece of the whole space. Further up near the gate, some climbers will go in along the fence as well. Over time, they'll soften the whole passage and break up the fence line. That's when a space like this really starts to feel like a garden, rather than just a path. Tuscan topping is a crushed sandstone. It compacts down into a firm, natural-looking finish that's permeable, low maintenance, and has a warm terracotta color that works really well against the brick steppers and the curtain edging. This is also the reason I put that plastic strip against the wall earlier. A side passage like this one is often shaded by the house or the fence, so it's the last part of the property to dry out after rain. Moisture just sits there against the brickwork. The longer a space like this gets ignored, the more likely it is that moisture is slowly being absorbed into the wall. Rising damp is one of the most common moisture problems in older Australian homes. Groundwater gets drawn up through the pores of the brick and mortar, the same way a sponge absorbs water. It doesn't really stop at ground level either. It keeps climbing, carrying salts and contaminants with it. Left alone, it breaks down mortar, rots floor timbers, and encourages mold. By the time you see it, the damage is already well underway. The Romans understood this 2,000 years ago. They were using horizontal courses of slate inserted into walls as a physical moisture barrier. Same principle as what went in here, just 2,000 years earlier. The materials have changed over time. Slate first, then bitumen and felt, then polypropylene in the 60s and 70s. What went in against this wall is a simple plastic strip, the modern version of the same idea. And yet, a joint survey by the Royal Australian Institute of Architects, Archi Centre, and the University of Melbourne found that 45% of solid brick homes over 70 years old in Australia have rising damp. Another 25% of homes aged between 50 and 70 years have it too. The plastic strip creates a physical break between the topping and the wall. The wall should already have a damp course built into it, and this one does. But when materials sit right up against a brick house above that damp course, you're creating a bridge. The strip stops that. It's just simple insurance against a problem that takes years to show up and costs a lot more to fix. Most people don't find out until the damage is already done. The Tuscan topping carries through to the front as well. It ties the two spaces together and makes the whole property feel considered rather than two separate gardens. It's a small thing, but using the same material across both areas makes a real difference to how the property reads as a whole. Walk from the front to the side and it feels like one connected garden, not a patchwork of decisions made at different times by different people. That's actually been the whole theme of this job. The side passage was never given the same thought as the rest of the property. Now it has. Same tool the navvies used, same tool the trench diggers used, and nearly 2,000 years after Zhu Liang tried to keep it secret, it's still doing the same work, just with better ties. Today I'm working in Hawthorne East, one of Melbourne's inner suburbs, where I'll be giving some attention to a front garden. The front path is the entrance to someone's home. It's the first thing you walk when you arrive, and the last thing you walk when you leave. It sets the tone for everything behind the front door. The old path has already been half pulled up for some plumbing. Rather than patching it back up, we're going to build it properly and really lift this front garden. While I'm at it, there's some matching paving to do down the side of the house as well. The seasons are shifting. Summer has backed off, and the garden is responding. There are dozens of native coria around Melbourne, and right now most of them are putting on a show in their own subtle way. Early wattles are starting to colour up, and everything is adjusting to the change. It's a good time to be outside, and a great time to be landscaping. The remaining bricks from the old path are in good condition. I'm going to put them aside. They'll be used in a future project in this garden. Hawthorne gets its name from Charles Latrobe, who in 1840 remarked that the native scrub in the area, most likely tea trees and wattles, looked like flowering hawthorn bushes. By the 1880s, it had become one of Melbourne's better addresses. Grand Victorian houses, independent schools, prominent churches. Not old money exactly, more the suburb of people who had done well and wanted to live somewhere that reflected it. Merchants, professionals, people on the way up. The genuinely wealthy tended to be further out in Toorak and Kew, where the blocks were bigger. Hawthorne was aspirational. But Hawthorne East was a different story. While the western end was building its reputation, the eastern end, around Auburn, was digging clay out of the ground and firing it into bricks. The physical conditions were brutal. Outdoor work in all weather, heavy clay digging and kiln heat. The workers lived right next to their workplace in small cottages, essentially within sight of the industry that employed them. There was no minimum wage and no workplace protections worth speaking of. They were at the bottom of the wage scale, earning a fraction of what the merchants and professionals a kilometre away were taking home. Hawthorne's bricks, fired in pinks, blacks and browns, went into the polychromatic facades of the houses and buildings that gave the suburb its character. But the people who built Hawthorne couldn't afford to live in it. When the land boom collapsed in the 1890s, the housing industry went with it. Brickworks closed. Workers who had been buying their own homes lost them as the banks foreclosed. The boom ended badly for the people who had made it possible. It's now one of the most expensive postcodes in Melbourne. The clay pits are parks. The workers' cottages are renovated, heritage listed, and highly sought after. These are Oakley bricks. They have a good story behind them, which I'll get to shortly. Before the crushed rock goes down, I'm going to put some 50mm PVC pipe under the path. When irrigation is run to this garden, it can be threaded through these and pass underneath without having to dig the path up. The ends get taped to keep the dirt out, and leaving a piece of string through each one means any pipes or cables can be easily pulled through later. The levels on this path are quite technical. The property slopes from the footpath down towards the house, and the last thing we want is water washing onto the front veranda. The way I'm tackling it is to change the slope throughout the path, with the lowest point sitting on the main curve. From there, we can slope away from the veranda and tilt it slightly towards the garden bed to avoid any pooling. At the other end, the last section needs to twist to match the slope of the driveway, but I don't want that slope running the full length of the path. It would make it awkward to walk on. The bricks that just got dropped off carry the Oakley stamp and were made about 15 kilometres southeast of here. Oakley has a remarkably similar story to Hawthorne East. A suburb built on clay, with men doing the same hard, dirty work in the same era, under the same conditions. Back in the day, Oakley wasn't some quiet suburb. It was right in the thick of Melbourne's brickmaking scene, all because of the clay right underfoot there. That stuff was so good, they turned the whole area into pits, kilns, and works that churned out bricks for houses, walls, and everything else going up around the city. It was tough, hands-on stuff. One of the main Oakley brick sites had about 60 men working at full tilt, digging clay, mixing it in those old horse-drawn pug mills, pressing bricks by hand, and feeding the kilns non-stop. Then, the machines rolled in, stuff shipped over from England, and suddenly the output went through the roof. That shift from sweat and horses to proper industrial gear is what made places like Oakley tick for over a century. The land was originally sold by a man named Howard Clarton, although he also went by a few other names. He'd married one woman in South Australia, moved to India, married another woman there while still married to the first, moved that second family to Melbourne, worked as a land agent, and never stayed in one place more than 4 years. He appears regularly in court records. The street was originally named after him, however at some point it was changed to Stanford Road. Make of that what you will. The pits got deep, over 150 feet in places, starting as inclined shafts that opened into massive working faces. They were like underground worlds. In 1938, 2 men were working at the bottom of the quarry face when about 15 tons of rock fell from 10 meters above and crushed them. Their workmates dug them out with their hands. The company's inspector testified the quarry had always been worked with reasonable care, and that the collapse was due to an unusual formation in the rock, essentially arguing it couldn't have been predicted. The jury disagreed. It happened that the jury foreman was an old miner, someone who knew exactly what proper inspection looked like. They found the company negligent for failing to properly inspect the face. The coroner asked them to reconsider. They refused. After the war, many of the men who came home weren't willing to go back into the brickworks. And who could blame them? Before the war, there were 34 brickyards operating across Melbourne, employing over 1,000 men. After it, only 600 returned to the pits, because for some, there was nothing else. Now the clay is all dug out, and the works are long gone. The land's turned into parks and streets. But these bricks, they've outlasted it all. They've already done a job somewhere out there, and now they're going into this path for the next stage in life. The Hilux has been on every job for the past 12 years. Today, it passes the baton to a much younger D-Max. It's always a great feeling getting a new work vehicle. It's almost like I get older, but they stay the same age. Every trade has its essential tools. For a landscaper, it's not the plate compactor or the angle grinder. It's the ute. It's there on every job, every day, from the first load to the last cleanup. Everything else comes and goes, depending on the work. The ute is always there. Now, this is a curved path, so unlike straight paving, I can't use string lines to guide the rows. It has to be done by eye. What I can do is set one height line for the first row. Using a level, I can make sure that first row goes in at the correct height and angle by following the string. After that, every row is done off the one before it with a level. No more string. With the first row locked in, it's just me, the level, and a few hours of paving ahead, which is a good time to talk about the Aussie ute and where it came from. The story goes that back in 1933, a farmer's wife from Gippsland wrote a letter to Ford Australia. She and her husband couldn't afford two vehicles and wanted something that could get them to church on Sunday and carry pigs to market on Monday. The 22-year-old engineer at Ford's Geelong plant named Lewis Bant was given the problem. He took a 1933 coupe, extended the rear body panel all the way back, strengthened the chassis to carry a load, and the result rolled off the line in 1934 as the Ford Coupe Utility, the first Australian ute designed and built right here in Victoria. I can already feel the outrage coming through the camera. So before any of you American viewers start typing angry comments, yes, the Americans had pickup trucks before this. But they were truck-based, with a separate cab and tray bolted on. What Bant built was different. The tray was integrated into the body of a passenger car, one continuous structure. Australians have argued ever since that this makes it a distinct invention rather than a copy. It's a reasonable argument. Though it's also worth noting that Australians have a long history of claiming things that aren't actually theirs. Phar Lap, the Pavlova, Crowded House, the Flat White, all from New Zealand, and all happily claimed by the Australians as their own. Russell Crowe is also a Kiwi, though in that case New Zealand seemed fairly happy to let him go. Holden followed Ford in 1951 with their own version. The waiting list in the first year was around 70,000, in a country with a population of under 9 million. Ford and Holden traded the market back and forth for the next 60 years, until both stopped making cars in Australia in 2016 and 2017. When local manufacturing ended, so did the original ute. What replaced it were Japanese and American pickups, separate cab, separate tray, and truck-based like the American pickup. The thing Bant designed no longer exists in production, but the word stayed. In Australia, if it's got a tray, it's a ute, regardless of how it's built or where it comes from. Strictly speaking, the Hilux and the D-Max are both pickups by the original definition, but good luck telling that to anyone on an Australian job site. This side area is a bit different to the front path in terms of drainage. Rather than sloping it towards a garden bed, we're sloping it into the middle of the paving, keeping water away from both houses and letting it run down to a strip drain at the bottom. The gate and the concrete beyond it will be redone at some point, but that's not this video. Those bricks we saved from the old front path are going to get a second life here as well. When the concrete gets redone, they'll border it to make it feel more deliberate rather than just a slab sitting there. Unlike the curved front path, I can actually use string lines here. It makes the whole process significantly faster. The string gives me a continuous reference for height and alignment. I still use the level constantly to make sure everything is sitting perfectly flat and falling on the correct angle, but having the string there as a guide speeds things up considerably. To tie this space into the front garden, I'm going to curve the garden bed and border it with the same pattern we used on the front path. The side passage of a house has always been the forgotten space. In the Victorian era, it had a very specific purpose. Coal deliveries came through here, tradesmen came through here, and night soil collection came through here. Everything that kept a household running, but wasn't fit to be seen from the street, came down the side. The front was for presentation. The side was for everything else. As houses modernized with sewerage systems, gas and refrigeration, most of those functions disappeared, and the side passage went with them. It became the place you put the bins, some spare roofing tiles, empty plant pots, an old coiled-up garden hose, and that forgotten bag of potting mix from 3 years ago that now has holes in it. This one is getting some attention. It's not going to be a feature space. It doesn't need to be. But by using the same brick and carrying the same curved border detail through from the front path, it stops feeling like a separate afterthought and starts feeling like part of the same garden. That connection matters. A side passage that ties into the front garden turns dead space into something that actually links the street to the rest of the property. And that's worth doing properly. This path curves for a reason. There's a long tradition in garden design of using curves to change how you experience a space. A straight path is efficient, it gets you where you're going, and there's nothing wrong with that. But a curved path does something different. It slows you down slightly and makes the journey feel more deliberate. There's a shift in mood as you walk. You're not just moving from the gate to the front door, you're arriving. It's a small thing, but the people who walk it will feel it, even if they can't explain why. In the 1880s, a landscape designer named William Guilfoyle, the man responsible for the Melbourne Botanic Gardens, was actively pushing back against the rigid straight lines that dominated European garden design at the time. He introduced curves into Australian private gardens, not for decoration, but because he understood that the way you move through a space changes how you experience it. That idea hasn't changed, but somewhere along the way, it got lost. Melbourne's newer suburbs are full of front paths that nobody really put any thought into. A straight line of concrete from the gate to the door, poured and forgotten before the house was even finished. The curve on the front path isn't there just because it looks nice. It's there because it changes how you arrive at the house. It makes the path feel considered rather than just functional. And when the garden around it is planted, which is the next stage of this project, that curve will become the spine that everything else grows around. And for this garden, it's just the beginning. Autumn doesn't last long in Melbourne. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. The new rig passed its first test and has remained remarkably clean, at least for now. There comes a point in many gardens where lawn stops making sense. This is one of those places. It's patchy, it needs constant maintenance, it uses a lot of water, and it gives very little back. In a bush setting like this, it always feels like it's fighting the conditions. The plan is simple. Turn it into something productive and more aesthetically pleasing, with structured beds, brick paths, and eventually a small greenhouse. The first question when you strip turf here is what's underneath. Often it's shale. This time, surprisingly, it's decent soil. Dark, with some structure, worth keeping. By marking out the different sections, the layout can be adjusted before any real work begins. This rectangle will be levelled and paved. It will form the base for the greenhouse. A brick path will wind through the centre and define the beds on either side. And a brick border will run along both edges to tie it back to the rest of the garden I built last year. We're working on a slope, so the greenhouse base needs to be level. The lower side gets built up, so the structure doesn't sit on a lean. The path and beds will follow the natural fall, which leaves the garden with two subtle planes. The string lines mark the finished heights for the paving. They keep everything consistent, so the path stays flat and even as it moves through the space. Getting these right now matters. Once they're set, I'll know exactly how much needs to be cut out and where material needs to be built up before the digging begins. The paving build-up is 80 mil of crushed rock, 30 of mortar, and about 70 for the brick. So I need to dig down roughly 180 mil below the string lines for it all to fit. Crushed rock goes in first. It forms the structural layer beneath the paving, and most of the strength in a job like this comes from what sits underneath, not what you see on top. The strings mark the finished height of the paving. The crushed rock sits 100 mil below them to allow for the mortar and the brick. That depth needs to stay consistent across the whole area. It's spread evenly, worked into the edges, and checked against the lines as it goes. This stage doesn't look like much, but it decides how the paving will behave long term. The narrow sections under the border get compacted by hand first. The plate won't fit in there, so the tamper makes sure those edges are just as solid as the rest. The wider sections can be compacted with the plate. It does a far more consistent job than a hand tamper on areas this size. The vibration pulls the crushed rock together and drives out the air pockets. This is what really locks the base in. The greenhouse base sits higher than the path and beds below. The lower edge needs to be retained. By measuring down from the finished height, allowance is made for a row of bricks to support that built-up section. It's pushing 38 degrees today, which is not ideal for this sort of work. Once this is compacted, it becomes a dense, stable platform. It also allows moisture beneath the paving to drain away rather than sitting in the soil. These are reclaimed bricks, close to 100 years old. They'll be the main feature in this part of the garden, forming the paths and the borders and tying back to the work done here last year. There's weight to them. Dense, hard-fired, worn from a previous life. Moving them by hand takes time, but they bring a character that new materials just don't have. It's a cracking morning here in Elphin. Good light, cool air, much better than yesterday. The bricks will be set on mortar, giving the path, greenhouse base, and edging a solid, permanent finish. I'm laying this in a running bond pattern, with a border around the edge to match the brick edging used throughout the rest of the garden. This is the part of the job where you're close to the brick. It's a good time to think about what you're actually working with. Almost every reclaimed brick carries a stamp, and that stamp can tell you a lot. These ones read Auburn. The Auburn Brickworks operated in Hawthorne from 1909 through to the middle of the 20th century. The yards sat along Gardiner's Creek, where clay lay close to the surface. That clay built much of Melbourne's inner east. When you walk past the terraces in Richmond or the shop rows along Auburn Road, you're often looking at the same material, fired hard and built to last. These bricks were shaped from clay dug out of the ground and fired in kilns and hawthorn, then laid into houses and factories that stood for decades. Most of the buildings these bricks went into are still standing. These ones came out of a building that was demolished more recently. Rather than being sent to landfill, the mortar was knocked off and the bricks were stacked, moved, and sold again. When the clay ran out, the pit was filled in and eventually became John Gardner Reserve. If you've walked through that reserve and noticed the ground feels uneven in places, that's why. Most people have no idea they're walking on a former quarry that provided the clay used to build the houses they now live in. So each of these bricks has already had a life in the city. Now they're being laid into a garden in Eltham. The border runs down one side, starting to define the garden beds. What was only string and measurements is now brick and mortar. The curve is set with a simple garden hose. It's flexible, easy to move, and nothing is fixed at this stage. You can step back and adjust it until the line feels balanced in the space. Once the bricks go down, that shape is permanent. A curve adds interest. It softens the area and creates a sense of flow. It makes the garden feel less formal, nor relaxed, almost cottage-like. A space you can move through slowly. A small haven, away from the noise of everything else. They're not perfect. Edges are chipped, faces are worn, but that wear is honest. It shows time, use, and character. You can see where mortar once sat and where edges have been knocked. New materials try to imitate this, but it's not something you can manufacture. It only comes from having already done the work once before. There's something grounding about that. The material has already proven itself. It doesn't need to look pristine to feel solid. Brick is a simple material, but it carries memory with it. It's not about sentimentality, it's about keeping good material in use. Another chapter in a different setting. Instead of a straight line, this border gets a gentle curve. It breaks up the rigidity and makes the edge feel less harsh. Today I get to do my favourite and least favourite parts of paving, the cuts and the grouting. Cuts demand attention. Each one must fit precisely, or the line of the path will look off. The work is steady and deliberate. There is a quiet satisfaction in seeing a triangle come together exactly as it should. Any broken bricks get set aside for the cuts. There's no point cutting into a full clean brick when these pieces already need trimming. It keeps wastage down and makes better use of what's in the pile. The whole bricks stay whole. The broken ones own their place. Cuts demand attention. Grouting demands endurance. One is precise and satisfying. The other is slow and methodical. But without this part, all the careful setting before it doesn't last. The grout mix is similar to the mortar, just slightly stronger. Mortar here is 4 parts sand to 1 part cement. For grout, it's 3 to 1. It's also mixed wetter. That helps it flow down into the joints, but the extra water weakens it slightly, which is why the cement content is increased. The key is making sure the mix reaches the bottom of the gap. It's easy for it to bridge near the top and leave a void underneath. I use a small 6mm mortar smoothing tool to push it all the way down and make sure the joint is fully packed. Once the joints are filled properly, the sponging begins. The cleaner you get the bricks now, the less chance there is of needing an acid wash later. Different sponges behave differently. Some drag more, some lift more. I usually rotate between a few until the surface is clean without pulling the joint back out. Even the sand makes a difference. Brick sand varies from yard to yard. Some sponge off easily, others are much more stubborn. I'm careful about which yard I use for grouting sand. A batch that doesn't sponge cleanly can turn a straightforward day into a really long one. The colour will lighten considerably as it dries, so what you see today isn't the final result. The existing soil had structure and some life in it, but vegetables are demanding. Adding fresh soil as well as compost is about depth and nutrients. Compost improves fertility, but it isn't a complete growing medium on its own. You're building a root zone that can actually support crops, not just keep them alive. A deeper, looser soil profile allows roots to move freely, access moisture, and establish properly. It's not just about feeding the plant, it's about building the right conditions from the start. Fresh soil for depth, compost for structure, manure for steady nutrients. Improving the soil now sets the garden up properly. Everything that follows depends on it. A greenhouse isn't just another structure. It's a way to control the environment. Warmth, light, humidity, in a way the open garden never can. In Victoria, weather shifts quickly. Cold snaps can stall growth outdoors. Inside, air and soil warm earlier and stay warmer for longer, which means seedlings can be started weeks ahead of the season and crops can run later into the cooler months. The enclosure also protects plants from wind, heavy rain, insects and birds. That same warmth needs managing though. Ventilation is essential to keep air moving and prevent mold. Water use becomes more efficient too. With less evaporation, moisture stays consistent, which is especially important for young plants and heat-loving crops. Sitting on the brick base we prepared, the structure is stable and permanent. It turns what was once unproductive lawn into a working space. It isn't decoration. It's a tool, a way to get more from the land already here. Mulch goes on last. It slows evaporation, keeps weeds down, and protects the soil biology underneath. It also buffers temperature, keeping the soil cooler through heat and reducing sharp fluctuations after rain. As it breaks down, it feeds the soil gradually and improves structure over time. Bare soil degrades quickly. Covered soil improves. Paths guide movement. Beds give the space purpose. The greenhouse extends the season. Each element has a job, and together they make the garden work. What was once lawn is now productive ground. The structure is permanent, but the planting will change year to year. That's how a working garden should be. The bricks have already had one life in the city. Now they set the bones for something that will evolve slowly around them. It's not dramatic, it's deliberate, and it will be used. Work like this is rarely simple. On ground like this, every step leaves a mark, and every decision has consequences, whether you notice them straight away or not. This job is in the leafy suburb of Eltham, in Melbourne's north, a part of the city where the bush still presses in fairly close, and the landscape tends to set the terms for how gardens take shape. This garden is shaped entirely by the hill. There's no separating the two. Every movement through the space is an interaction with the slope. Over time, the areas under pressure start to reveal themselves. Soil shifts, surfaces thin out, and certain lines become more travelled than others. When that starts happening, it's usually a sign that the landscape is ready for a bit more structure. I've done some work here previously, mainly low retaining to slow erosion across the slope. There's also this paved area further up the hill that has become a natural gathering point. One of the new parts will connect directly into that space, which helps everything feel more intentional rather than fragmented. Much of Eltham is shale. Once you get below the top layer, the ground turns hard very quickly. So with the hard shale, steep slope, and record-breaking temperatures, I've definitely got my work cut out for me on this job. On a hill like this, you start to notice where people naturally walk. Certain lines get used more than others, and over time, those areas begin to wear. The surface thins out, especially after rain, and the slope starts to erode pretty quickly. The aim here is not to invent new routes, but to support the ones already forming. These paths are not just decorative. They are working routes, designed to make movement easier on a slope that would otherwise be tiring and unstable. Along some sections of the path, low retaining is needed to hold the edge in place. The first step is digging the holes for the posts and setting them in concrete so that I have something to attach the sleepers to. Eltham sits on the edge of Melbourne's urban spread, but it's never really behaved like a suburb in the conventional sense. Long before houses and roads, this area was shaped by steep gullies, creeks, and dense bushland. The land here resisted easy clearing, which is one of the reasons it stayed relatively intact compared to flatter parts of Melbourne. In the early 20th century, Eltham became closely associated with artists, craftspeople, and designers who were drawn to that landscape rather than trying to tame it. The area developed a strong arts and crafts influence, favouring handmade materials, local stone, timber, and buildings that followed the contours of the land instead of flattening them. That mindset still lingers. Gardens here tend to work with slopes, trees, and natural movement. Paths curve because the land curves. Even today, Eltham holds onto that bush character more strongly than many inner suburbs. Kangaroos, wallabies, and birdlife are still part of daily life in many streets, and erosion, drainage, and access remain real, practical concerns rather than theoretical ones. Working on a hill like this feels very much in keeping with that history. The challenge is not how to dominate the slope, but how to move through it carefully, leaving as much of its character intact as possible. In this section, the main issue is surface movement due to the steep slope. Building one large retaining wall here would require engineering and permits, and it would change the character of the hill. Instead, I'm putting in a series of smaller walls to stabilize the area and create opportunities for planting, which will naturally help slow erosion and runoff. This section is pretty much solid rock, so it's time to get an old friend to give me a hand. The tallest wall is around 400 millimeters. Stepping the slope like this helps hold the ground in place, allows for planting, and makes the area more usable without introducing a dominant structure. The posts are cypress pine, which holds up well in ground contact and works reliably for this kind of structure. Setting up string lines helps keep the posts aligned and gives a clear sense of the path shape before they're set in concrete. The alignment follows the hill rather than fighting it, and by creating a gentle turn, it will help reduce the chance of water building speed down the surface. Once the concrete is set, I'm going to be attaching red gum sleepers to the posts to form the retaining for our path and for the terraces on the hill. They're durable, stable, and sit comfortably in this bush setting without drawing too much attention to themselves. Red gum is one of the hardest Australian hardwoods, which is exactly why it's been used outdoors for over a century. It's dense, tight-grained, and built to take a beating, so it works brilliantly for decks, steps, and heavy-duty retaining walls. It handles ground contact really well, with many red gum species rated Class 1 or Class 2 for durability, meaning it can last decades above and even in the ground when installed properly. It's a stunning timber, rich, warm, and full of character. But how sustainable it is depends entirely on where it comes from. Victoria has shut down commercial native forest logging, so you won't see red gum being cut from public forests like it used to. Most of what's still around is from older stock, private land harvests or plantations, which is why I'm careful to only use red gum from managed sources, rather than old growth or poorly regulated native forests. That's how you protect habitat, hauler-dependent wildlife, and the long-term health of these ecosystems. River red gums are incredible trees. They can live for hundreds of years, survive floods and droughts, and even regrow after losing most of their canopy. That's exactly why, when I do use red gum in landscaping, I'm really careful about where it comes from. Freshly cut, the timber is a deep, almost blood red colour, which is where the name comes from. Over time, that rich red mellows into warm browns and soft greys, giving it a naturally aged, lived-in look. If you want to keep the colour richer and more consistent, you can oil it. A good decking oil applied once or twice a year will slow UV grain, bring out the grain, and protect the surface without hiding what makes red gum so distinctive. The temperature is getting close to 40 degrees now, and I'm on about t-shirt number 5. I think that will do me today. The tools are actually getting too hot to pick up. The plan for this top section is to create a path linking the driveway to the paved area. It's already being regularly used as a path, so now we're just going to formalize it with surface material, shaping it into a soft, natural curve that feels like it belongs, rather than a straight, rigid line. I want the path to finish at the same height as the paving, so some of the soil will have to be removed to bring the level down and create a smooth transition. In the 1860s, Victoria was gripped by gold rush fever, and places like Eltham sat on the edge of that chaos. Miners, traders, and opportunists poured through the region, turning quiet tracks into rough supply routes, lined with makeshift huts, sly grog shanties, and basic services catering to anyone heading to the smaller goldfields in the Yarra Valley and nearby hills. Digging into this ground now shows how tough it would have been to chase gold here. The soil is shallow in parts, with hard shale and rock sitting not far below the surface, breaking up in studum chunks that don't give up easily. Miners would have swung picks and shovels into this same tough layer, sifting rubble and clay for tiny specks of gold, often for months with nothing to show for it. It wasn't only luck that was needed to find gold, it was brute persistence in an environment that didn't want to give anything up. It was a time of lawlessness, opportunity, and legend, with bushranger tales swirling around anyone moving gold through the bush. Eltham itself developed more as a timber and farming hub than as a major gold camp. But the energy of the rush shaped the district, bringing people, money, and stories that still echo in local folklore today. Even now, that history is still written into the land. The rock close to the surface, the shallow soils, and the way water moves through the slopes are the same conditions that shaped how people worked here more than a century ago. Very little about this ground is forgiving. It rewards patience rather than force, and it tends to resist anything that tries to move too quickly or too aggressively. Working in it today, you are reminded that this landscape has always asked people to slow down, pay attention, and adapt to what is there, rather than expecting it to bend easily to their plans. It's new boot day. They're about to take a serious beating, but look like they can handle it. By attaching plastic sheeting to the back of the sleepers, a simple barrier is created between the timber and the soil. It helps keep constant moisture off the wood, stopping water from sitting against it and slowing decay over time. With red gum, it's almost unnecessary. It already performs extremely well in ground contact, but it does no harm. It's a small layer of insurance without changing how the structure behaves. With the sleepers in place, the focus can shift to leveling out the path. The path is going to be granitic sand, but to help with drainage, a layer of crushed rock forms the base, giving the surface something firm to sit on and helping it hold its shape over time. When it's compacted, the rock locks together, which limits movement and reduces the chance of the path settling unevenly, especially on a slope like this. You might notice the plastic bands on some of the trees through here. These are possum bands. They're used to stop possums climbing up into the canopy, where repeated leaf stripping can stress trees badly over time, and in some cases lead to decline or death. It's a simple, non-invasive way to protect vulnerable trees from ongoing damage. In bush settings like this, repeated browsing can place a lot of stress on trees over time. Reducing that pressure early helps them stay healthy, especially through hot and dry periods like this one. This part of Victoria is stunningly beautiful, especially early in the day. It's cool and still now, but it's shaping up to be another hot one. These rocks will be used to retain the top path. They're granite, chosen to match the existing stone already used through the garden, so the path feels like a continuation of what's already there. Stone works well here because it allows the path to curve and respond to the slope. It makes the edge feel softer and more natural, helping the path flow through the garden rather than cutting across it. The stone edge changes depending on what the ground needs. In some places, it works as a small retaining wall, holding soil where the slope is under pressure. In others, only a few stones are used, just enough to support the edge and keep things in place. That variation helps the path feel informal and natural, rather than reading as a continuous, formal structure. To help hold the surface in place, a cellular-based system called natural paving is being used. It's made by Stroll, a New Zealand company, and is produced from 100% recycled materials. The system sits beneath the granitic sand. Once it is filled, it becomes invisible, but it plays an important role in how the path performs. The cellular structure helps lock the surface together, which limits movement and reduces the tendency for the sand to migrate downhill during heavy rain. It allows water to pass through freely, rather than running across the surface, which improves drainage and helps reduce erosion over time. The product itself is recycled plastic, but it's designed for long-term use below ground, where it reduces ongoing maintenance, repeated material replacement, and sediment movement through the garden. On a slope like this, that trade-off makes practical sense. Although its recommended use is with toppings and smaller aggregates, I've found that it also works really well for granitic sand. If you're interested in finding out more about it, I'll put a link to the product in the description. Look at this little guy, a marbled gecko. They're really common around here, but this isn't the best spot for him. He's a bit cold and slow, so I'll move him somewhere safer before he gets hurt. They're generally seen as a native lizard that helps control insects, but experts think they actually got into Melbourne via transported building materials and rocks from other parts of Australia. That checks out. Seems like this guy hitched a ride in the granitic sand. Granitic sand is a beautiful material for bush settings. Its colour sits naturally in the landscape, it's permeable, and it feels comfortable underfoot. in a way harder surfaces never quite do. It suits gardens like this because it doesn't try to dominate the space and instead settles in quietly. It also works well with water. Rain can move through it rather than running across the surface, which helps avoid puddling and keeps the path feeling soft and informal rather than sealed and rigid. Visually, it blends in. Over time, it weathers gently, picking up leaf litter, dust, and subtle changes in tone that help it settle into its surroundings. The challenge with granitic sand is that it is honest about how it behaves. On a slope, it wants to move. Heavy rain can slowly pull material downhill, thinning the surface in high-traffic areas and building it up in others. The steeper the ground, the more noticeable that movement becomes. On flatter sites, this is much less of a concern. Occasional topping up is usually enough. Here, with the constant fall of the land and regular foot traffic, it was something that needed to be addressed from the beginning, rather than managed later. That is where the cellular system comes into play. By supporting the sand from underneath, it allows the surface to behave more predictably. The path still looks and feels like granitic sand, but it is far less likely to migrate, thin out, or need regular correction after heavy weather. During very heavy downpours, the top layer will still shift slightly, as it should, but the bulk of the material remains in place, held by the cells beneath. The aim is not to lock the surface in place completely, but to guide how it moves. Done this way, the path stays usable, drainage is maintained, and the material can age naturally without becoming a maintenance problem in the future. Granitic sand suits areas like this for a reason. Soils around Eltham and through Melbourne's northeast tend to be shallow and variable, shaped by underlying geological material rather than deep loams, which influences how water moves after rain. Using materials that reflect that landscape helps the garden feel settled rather than imposed. The path does not pretend the ground is something it isn't. It works with what is already here. The soil through this area is difficult to work with. Once you get below the surface, it quickly turns to shale and rock, which makes it hard for plants to establish and thrive without some help. For now, some compost will be worked through the soil to start improving conditions, but planting at this time of year would be working against the weather. All planting will happen in autumn, when the heat has eased. At that point, larger planting holes will be dug and backfilled with fresh compost and potting mix, giving the plants the best possible chance to establish in what's otherwise a very tough location. The local arborist chipped up some dead trees on the property, so rather than letting that material go to waste, the mulch will be spread back through the garden. Mulch is one of the simplest things you can add to a slope, but it makes a real difference. It helps protect the soil surface, slows evaporation, and protects the ground during heavy rain, rather than letting water hit bare soil and run straight off. Over time, it breaks down and feeds the soil beneath, which is especially important in an area like this, where the ground is thin and rocky. Breaking the hill into smaller terraces does not remove the slope, but it changes how the ground behaves. Movement becomes more gradual, water slows down, soil has more opportunity to settle. It also opens the door for planting, which is one of the most effective ways to stabilize a slope long term. Plants do what hard structures alone cannot. Their roots bind soil, absorb water, and soften the visual impact of retaining. Combined with mulch, they help the garden move toward a more stable, self-supporting system, rather than something that constantly needs correcting. The hill is still steep. That has not changed, and nor should it. The goal was never to erase its character, only to make movement easier, reduce erosion, and allow the garden to settle more comfortably into itself. Over time, the materials will soften, plants will establish, and the parts will feel as though they have always been here. Working on slopes like this is less about control and more about understanding. The land usually tells you what it needs. The job is to listen carefully enough to respond with restraint. This is Eltham, on the northeastern edge of Melbourne, a suburb that's defined by bush, slope, and irregular ground. This corner of the garden sits on the slope, but it doesn't really serve a purpose. Water moves through here quickly, and nothing holds your attention. It remains unresolved. The plan is to create a small pond here, just enough to give this part of the garden a clear centre. The final shape isn't fixed yet. It gets worked out as the digging begins, because ground like this is never empty. There's always something underneath. It doesn't take long to find the first obstacle. A major root from one of the nearby wattles runs straight through the area. Roots like this are critical. They carry water and nutrients, and they help stabilize the tree. Cutting through it isn't worth the risk, so instead of forcing the shape, the hole shifts slightly across. The soil stays on site. It just needs to move from the bottom of the garden to the top. So I guess today is going to be leg day. The paths built earlier now prove their value. What used to be difficult ground has now become a working route. Not far down, the shovel hits timber. The remains of an old stump are buried here. Termites are still working through it, slowly breaking it down and returning it back into the soil. They aren't the only creatures down here. A burrowing wolf spider emerges from the soil. Its instinct is to disappear again as quickly as possible. I'll move it to a safer spot. As the hole deepens, the final shape starts to become clearer. The sides are stepped deliberately. These terraces will support the stone, allowing it to lock into the ground rather than sit on the surface. But the deeper layers are different. The soil has become dense and heavily compacted. It's going to require some heavier tools. Eltham wasn't built quickly. For a long time, this was isolated country. It was difficult to reach. The ground was rough, and it was far enough from the city that most people didn't consider living here. But that isolation attracted a certain kind of person. People who were willing to work with their hands. People looking for space, privacy, and the freedom to build something of their own. That began to change in the early 1900s, when the railway line was extended out this far. Suddenly, the city was within reach, and more people started arriving. More homes began to appear along the rail line first, then gradually spread outward into the surrounding hills. The suburb grew over time. More houses, more roads, more structure. But the ground itself never changed. Every project still begins the same way, by breaking into it. This route helps anchor the pond visually. The stonework will integrate around it, reinforcing the sense that it belongs here. With the excavation complete, attention now turns to the stone. The stone used here comes from Coldstream, roughly 15 kilometers from here. It's a volcanic rock, formed millions of years ago under intense heat and pressure, then exposed over time as the landscape slowly changed. Its strength makes it ideal for structural work. It resists compression. It holds its shape under load. It doesn't deform. It carries weight exactly as it is. Each piece is completely unique. Different edges, different faces, different proportions. There's no uniform size. Every stone has to be selected individually and its place worked out by hand. Each piece transfers its weight downward, locking everything together through mass alone. No mortar, no fixings, just gravity and careful placement. Using local stone also connects the structure back to its surroundings. This material already exists throughout the region. The colors match the soil, the textures match the landscape. Nothing feels introduced. It settles into place as though it's always been here. Now it just needs to be moved into position. Before the stone can go in, the base needs to be prepared. A thick layer of sand goes down first. This creates a soft, even surface, ensuring nothing sharp sits directly beneath the liner. With that in place, the pond liner can be installed. It's carefully positioned, then trimmed to size. The offcuts aren't wasted. They're placed beneath the liner, adding an extra layer of protection. There will be a lot of movement across this surface while placing the stone. Protecting it now ensures the structure above won't be compromised later. Every time I build with stone, it feels a little different. Working with it changes the pace. It asks for time, attention to weight, to balance, to the feel of every piece. You can't rush it, and you can't fake it. Before work can continue, I'll need to grab another load of rock. Each stone plays a specific role, and the structure determines what's needed. I'm not just loading rock at random. Each piece is chosen by hand for its shape, its weight, and where it will fit. While I'm here, I'll grab a few smooth river stones as well. They'll protect the liner and form the base of the pond. Getting the stone to site is just part of the process. Before it can shape and become part of the landscape, it has to arrive there first. Building with stone like this takes patience. Each piece has to be turned, tested, and adjusted until it settles naturally. Straight walls are easy, but creating something that feels like it belongs here takes more time. Dry stone construction is one of the oldest building methods in the world. For thousands of years, stone has been stacked without mortar, relying entirely on weight and balance to hold it together. The strength comes from weight, placement, and the way each stone locks into the next. That same method arrived in Victoria with early European settlers in the 1800s. As farmland was cleared, stone emerged everywhere. Heavy, irregular, impossible to ignore. It couldn't be buried, it couldn't be burned, so it was stacked. Stone by stone, farmers built boundary walls to define paddocks and clear the ground for grazing. Not built for appearance, built because the stone was already there. Over time, extensive networks of dry stone walls spread across Victoria. Many still stand today, not maintained, not repaired, just holding their form through balance alone. They've survived decades of weather, ground movement, and time. When each stone is placed correctly, the structure becomes self-supporting. It adapts, it settles, it endures. Even now, the process remains the same. Each piece turned, adjusted, placed carefully, not forced, just allowed to find its position. Water plays an important role in landscapes like this. During long dry summers, even a small, reliable water source can support birds, insects, and other wildlife moving through the area. It becomes part of the local ecosystem. But water also changes how a space feels. It draws attention, creates reflection, introduces movement. Even when still, it brings a sense of calm, something the eye settles on, a fixed point within the landscape. With the pond filled, a small pump is introduced. It keeps the water moving, helping maintain water quality and preventing stagnation. Aquatic plants are added as well. Over time, they'll help stabilize the system, supporting life both above and below the surface. I left some gaps between the stone to allow for planting later. Fresh potting mix is added now, preparing these spaces in advance. But planting won't happen yet. In the middle of summer, survival rates are low. It's better to wait for cooler conditions, when plants can establish properly. In autumn, native species like correas and grevilleas will be introduced. Over time, they'll grow in around the pond, helping it settle naturally into the hillside. I've added an old branch to the pond as well. It provides a way out for any wildlife that may fall in. Small animals, reptiles, and insects can become trapped against smooth edges. This gives them a path back to safety. The ground here has been shaped slowly over time, by weather, by roots, by everything that passes through it. This pond becomes part of that same process. Stone settles, water moves, plants establish. Over time, the edges soften. The distinction between what was here before and what was added begins to disappear, until eventually it no longer appears built at all. It simply becomes part of the landscape.